Hello, I would like to welcome you to our webinar today on immigration issues on our southern border. I'm Richard Payne. I'm Vice Chair of the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice Immigration Committee. And we're looking forward to the panel today on this issue that's somewhat urgent. And thank you to the audience for hopping on and spending some time with us today. We have an outstanding panel for you, and we're hoping that you'll enjoy this webinar and learn what the realities are in the southern border. The Carnegie Corporation has estimated that 1 in 4 Americans are either immigrants or children of immigrants. They fled war, persecution, drought, come to America for a better life. And throughout history, we have always welcomed immigrants, and immigrants have been very beneficial to our country. I think most of us can think of the depictions of immigrants coming in the Atlantic through New York and seeing the Statue of Liberty. And on the inscription there is, "Give me your tired, your poor, and huddled masses yearning to be free." Yeah, it's our feeling that the immigration panel we have is very timely, and the topic has never been more important. All you have to do is turn on your television and look at the images of children at the border and other immigrants. The goal, as I mentioned, is for everyone to better understand what is currently happening at the southern border. Immigration is a very complex area. There are many tentacles to immigration, and we're going to be touching on some of those. Our country has always been a country that welcomes immigrants. Perhaps after this panel, you'll have an idea of, is that still true today? You can ask that and answer that. The panel that you're going to be hearing in a few minutes is well balanced, and we picked them, selected them for that. They're all experts in their field. They're highly regarded, dealing with litigation and landmark cases, also to advocacy, and also to some of the panel on the ground in the Rio Grande Valley and the border, day in, day out. At this time, I would like to introduce Patricia Rifo, who is the president of the ABA, and she is going to give you some welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for participating in and attending this important webinar on current immigration issues at the southern border. As many of you are aware, the American Bar Association has long advocated on policy and provided direct support to improve the immigration court system. We insist on due process safeguards, including access to counsel for those in removal proceedings. We have long made clear our opposition to mandatory detention of those in removal proceedings and our support for alternatives to detention. We call on our government to restore humanitarian protections for immigrants and asylum seekers and to preserve the rights of unaccompanied immigrant children. We are also leading advocates for comprehensive reform that, along with enhanced border security, promotes legal immigration based on family reunification and employment skills, that provides for new channels for future workers, and that charts a path to legal status for much of the undocumented population currently residing in the United States. The ABA's hands-on experience in the field helps drive our recommendations. Our Commission on Immigration operates 2 immigration legal service programs near the southern border, one near San Diego and the other in South Texas, which I had the honor of observing and volunteering with before the pandemic. We also provide the Children's Immigration Law Academy in Houston. These projects provide daily evidence of the many failures and the unique possibilities of the current immigration system and helps us chart a roadmap to making it fairer and more just. Our advocacy is also informed by our many collaborations across the ABA as we increasingly recognize the intersection of immigration issues with other areas of law, including criminal law, civil rights, children's rights, gender and racial justice, and court reform. As the voice of America's lawyers, the ABA is proud to represent all corners of our profession as we navigate the many challenges that lie ahead. This is what makes ours a robust voice, an authoritative voice for justice under the rule of law. But our voice is only as strong as our members. As the legal profession's leading voice, we need the perspective, involvement, and yes, the membership of all lawyers. So please, on social media and elsewhere, spread the word to your colleagues, and especially to the young lawyers and law students in your lives about your experience with this event and how you benefit from the American Bar Association. If you aren't already a member, please join us. If you are a member, consider participating in our Give the Gift of Membership program and introduce a colleague, a friend, or a family member to the benefits of supporting and being part of the ABA community, with opportunities to learn from leading voices in the law, make a real difference in people's lives, and give reward and meaning to our service as lawyers. There has never been a more important time for lawyers to stand in unity for the values of justice that are central to our profession. Our moderator today, Richard Pena, is a role model for all of us and is just one of the thousands of lawyers who've given so much of their careers in service to the ABA and our service to the profession and the public. Richard, thank you for all you do to advance our immigration work and activities in so many other areas. Thank you to the ABA's section of Civil Rights and Social Justice for producing this important event, and to our Commission on Immigration for its expertise and leadership. Let me also give my deepest thanks to our panelists and to everyone here for your commitment to justice. The American Bar Association is proud to stand with you.
Well, thank you, Patricia. And I'd like to echo what Patricia said. If you're not a member of the ABA, feel free to consider joining, and just go to the ABA website and you can follow the link and you'll be good to go. A couple of housekeeping matters. If you have questions throughout the panel, please feel free to just send the questions to us and we will try to address them. If we can't address them during the presentation, we hope to be able to get back with you after this webinar and give you an answer the best we can. Also, this is being recorded, so if you want to later view it or recommend somebody else view it, please feel free to do so. Now, I'm going to go right into the panel, and first we're going to have Lee Gillard. He is going to talk to us about family separation. Monica Kant is trafficking. Priscilla Ortha is going to be talking to us about asylum seekers and some of the children down in the border. And Danielle Dwyer on migrant and seasonal workers. I'm looking forward to it. In advance, I'd like to thank each of the panelists for joining, because they were handpicked by me and others to be on here because of the wide range of knowledge that they have and their expertise. Let me start. We're going to start with Lee. And Lee has been described to me as the expert in family separation in the country. And after reading about him, he certainly is. He's currently the Deputy Director of ACLU's National Immigration Project. He's in the national office in New York. He's recognized as one of the country's top public interest lawyers. as well as one of the nation's top 500 lawyers for all lawyers. And if Lee looks familiar, it's because you've probably seen him. He's a frequent speaker on national news on immigration and family separation. He's been on NBC, ABC, CNN, 60 Minutes, and many, many others that we don't have time to mention. He's argued dozens of cases on groundbreaking civil rights cases, including the Supreme Court and just about every federal court of appeals. And most recently, he's been the lead lawyer in the class action lawsuit of Miss Lee versus ICE. Now that's the case that Lee and his other lawyers went before a federal court, and the federal court found the practice of the Trump administration separating immigrant families on the border as unconstitutional. And there is a documentary out on Lee and having to do with that fight. He's a graduate of Columbia Law School, editor of Law Review, adjunct professor at the school, and he's testified as an expert witness in the Senate and House. Next, you're going to hear from Monica Kant. She is the national director of the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. Now, she's a former executive director of Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network. She's a national speaker, and she talks a lot about trafficking. Well, got her BA from Rutgers, JD from New England School of Law, and she represented detained asylum seekers as a detention attorney when she was working with the American Friends Service Committee. She has been given a Legal Legends Award by the American Constitutional Society, and also she gave a TED Talk on trafficking. She was passionate on implemented systematic change. Next, we're going to listen to Priscilla Orta. Priscilla is going to talk to us about asylum seekers and other immigration issues down at the border. She's down there in Harlingen. And you heard Patricia, the ABA president, talk about the pro bono project ABA has down there. She's a senior staff attorney for the ABA South Texas Pro Bono Asylum Representation Project, and it's known as ProBar. She's a graduate at Harvard, Columbia Law School, and she was a staff member of Law Review. She's an attorney advisor to our immigration judges in Harlingen. One of the things I found interesting about Priscilla is that she was raised by grandparents in San Antonio, and they moved to Defiance, Ohio. In June of 2019, she moved back to the Valley and is currently the supervising attorney of children's team at ProBar. And we hope she can talk a little bit about that. Her grandmother and grandfather were both migrant workers. And in fact, most of her family worked in the fields. And she's on the ground working with migrants, and again, based in the Rio Grande Valley, where a lot of the issues are. Finally, we're going to have Danielle Dwyer, migrant and seasonal workers is what she's going to be talking about. She's the managing attorney for Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, the Migrant Project. She's formerly managed farm workers programs, Legal Aid Bureau in Maryland and Delaware. She's a graduate of University of Texas School of Law, as well as Chicago School of Law. She's represented farm workers in federal courts in 7 states, and she's on the ground in the Valley representing farm workers. And when you think about what she does, think about Cesar Chavez and the type of issues that he dealt with. Well, that's what she deals with. So thank you to the panelists. Thanks everybody for joining us. And before anything else, we're going to get right into the presentations by these renowned panelists. And I'm going to start with Lee. Lee, the Trump administration had a policy of separating children from the families at the US-Mexico border. And you're the lead lawyer for ACLU on the National Class Action the case of Miss L versus ICE, where a federal judge held the practice unconstitutional. You've talked about it a lot. I've read about it. I've heard you. But can you tell us, well, about the background of the case and where we stand and what's going on?
Yeah, sure. Let me just start by thanking Richard for inviting me, and it's an honor to be on this panel with all these other great panelists, and for all the work you've done, Richard, for the legal community for so many years, and to thank the ABA and Patricia's leadership. The ABA has been such a force on immigration, both on the ground and in national advocacy. So, I think we all owe the ABA and you and Patricia a great debt of gratitude, and obviously people on the panel from the ABA. So the family separation practice, I suspect a lot of people know the broad outlines. In 2017, we began hearing that there might be family separation practice, but then the administration denied it. However, we began hearing on the ground that it was actually happening. And so through the help of NGOs on the ground, we began actually compiling stories of family separation. And I went out to ultimately visit who was the lead plaintiff, Miss L, in San Diego, and she was gaunt, hadn't been eating, hadn't been sleeping, and told the story of how she had come from the Congo with her little girl, so 6 years old at the time, and had the girl taken away, not told why. The little girl was begging and screaming, "Please don't take me away." They never told the mom why they were taking the little girl away. We went to court on behalf of her, but ultimately expanded it to a class action. And the government said, with respect to that individual, Miss L, well, we thought maybe she wasn't really the mother because she didn't have her papers. But of course, she had just done 3 months of basically walking from the Congo and getting on buses, but had been robbed multiple times. Of course, she didn't have the papers, but it was clear the little girl was actually with the parent. And the judge just said, well, why don't you do a quick DNA test? Of course, it turned out to be the biological mother. We went into court and said, we think this is happening widespread. We thought maybe there were a few hundred. The judge said, this is brutal and unconscionable policy. We ultimately now know that more than 5,500 children were separated, hundreds of whom were just babies and toddlers, and that the Trump administration had actually been potentially budgeting for 26,000 separations, but for the injunction, the lawsuit, ending it. We are now, fortunately, the Biden administration in negotiations to get these families relief. That's our hope, that at the end of the day, we will not only be able to find all the families, because we still are looking for 391 families of the 5,500 that we know, more than 5,500. But we also want them to have social services when they come back, mental health services, because the families were so traumatized, additional benefits, monetary compensation, and I think most importantly, what our government owes them, because we deliberately did this to them, is some peace of mind, so permanent status in the United States, so they never have to fear being sent back to danger again. Right now, we are in the process of beginning to bring back families, which is good. I think we're hoping it speeds up even more now that the process is in place. We're negotiating for all of the other things. We're hoping all this gets done. President Biden has said he's committed to this. This was an historic moral stain, but I think we all in the legal community and wider advocacy community and just regular citizens need to, and everyone in the community, not citizens obviously in that sense, but everyone in the country needs to push to keep it on the front burner, because ultimately I think, as all the panelists on this in this group will tell you, is you can do a lot through the courts, but to make real structural civil rights change, you need a widespread push from everyone. It needs to become a big moral issue. And I think, fortunately, family separation did, but I think we need to continue to have it on the front burner.
Lee, I want to ask you about the Title 42 challenge that you bring in. But before I do that, I'd like you to talk about I've heard that the government actually hid some of the children from you and your group.
Yeah, so, thanks for that question, Richard. We initially went in and said, we think there's several hundred families who have been separated. When we won, the court said to the government, hand over the list to the ACLU of all the families who have been separated. They handed over 2,500, which astounded us. And we thought that was it. And so we searched for all the families and ultimately found them. But then there was a report from Health and Human Services saying, wait, our investigation shows there's been way more families separated, potentially thousands. We went back to court. The government said, yeah, but they were given away to sponsors and foster families. So we didn't bother telling you because they would have already been done before the injunction. And the judge said, wait, you have to tell us about all these families. It's the same practice. That's just an arbitrary date you're picking about when you're going to tell us. The government then wanted 2 years, not to find the families, but just give the ACLU the list of names. And the judge said 2 years, just give them the list. And the government then candidly admitted they hadn't kept track of the kids and families, and they were going to have to go through all the paper records. Ultimately, the judge said, I want you to give it to the names to the ACLU on a rolling basis and all within 6 months. So then there ended up being thousands more, but it was never disclosed. The other horrible part of what the Trump administration did is not disclose all the data to find the families. So we have been searching for families. It turned out the Trump administration had additional data that would have helped us, addresses, phone numbers, that type of thing. And only where it became an issue in the second presidential debate did all of a sudden they turn over more data. And so we have been searching for these families for so long. And amazingly, we still don't know where 391 are. These are the 391 the government didn't turn over. So it's still very, very late in the process.
And from what I remember, you and others formed some nonprofit groups that went door to door in Central America looking for the families. Is that right?
Yeah. So what happened was the Trump administration said, well, a lot of parents have been deported without their children. They shouldn't be part of the case. The judge said, well, wait, they're definitely part of the case. They weren't even in a worse situation because they're in another country now worrying about their children. And then the Trump administration said in court, well, we're not going to find them. And so I stood up in court and said, well, we'll find them because a lot of people want to help. And so we formed the steering committee made up of Kids in Need of Defense, the Women's Refugee Commission, Justice in Motion, which has human rights defenders in Central America, which is going door to door and doing an amazing job, as well as the law firm Paul Weiss, who's put in enormous amount of hours and resources. And that steering committee is responsible for finding the parents abroad, with other groups that have also helped in an informal way. But yeah, ultimately, it's just been the private bar that's been looking for these families, not the government.
All volunteer?
Yeah, all volunteer.
We have a little bit of time, not too much left, but can you briefly talk to us about the challenges to the Title 42 policy that you're hitting up and that bars asylum seekers from entering the country because of COVID concerns? What's going on there?
Yeah, I want to be quick about that. So Title 42 was a policy implemented by the Trump administration. The Trump administration had been trying to stop asylum seekers from coming in for their entire 4 years. And then when COVID hit, they thought, okay, well, we can have a silver bullet. We can stop all asylum seekers from coming in, which is what we always wanted to do, and claim it's too dangerous. We never thought that was lawful, and we sued about it. We also thought it was never justified from a public health standpoint because we said you can test, you can quarantine where it's necessary, but you can't just turn asylum seekers back and expel them. When the Biden administration came in, they exempted unaccompanied minors from that policy, but unfortunately have kept the policy with respect to families and adults, including families with little children. And the policy allows them to just turn people back and send them back to danger without any asylum hearing. So we have a lawsuit going now. We're negotiating with the Biden administration, but I think it's one of those issues that we all need to speak out about because right now you have families in the most dangerous conditions. And I think our panelists will be able to speak to it very directly, who were not being allowed in to apply for asylum. We had said after World War II, we would never turn people back and not give them an asylum hearing when they're in danger. That's what we're doing. It was never justified, we believe, as a public health measure, even back when Trump administration did it. It's certainly not now with the country open. And so I think it's an issue that I hope the audience will learn more about and speak out about, because I think it's one of those issues that's fallen under the radar screen, but yet it is causing enormous harm to asylum seekers, in particular families, I think.
Lee, we got a question from Linda in the audience. It says, is there a way to hold officials responsible for lies and lack of compensation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And so right now we have a lawsuit, not only suing the United States about what they did with family separation, but we sued the individual federal officials who were responsible for family separation, from Attorney General Sessions, Stephen Miller down the line. I don't know how that lawsuit is ultimately going to play out, but I think a lawsuit's one way, but I also think the public speaking out, Congress holding hearings, that kind of accountability really needs to occur. So it's a very good question.
Just one final question, Lee. Do you see a difference in the philosophy of the Biden administration versus the prior administration?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I just want to be clear, we are deeply troubled by the Biden administration keeping Title 42 for families and adults, but the Biden administration has done an enormous amount of good work on immigration and is slowly getting rid of all the horrible Trump administration practices, putting aside Title 42. So we are very pleased with the way this administration is going about attacking the egregious Trump administration policies for asylum seekers, for others, not just asylum seekers. I think ultimately, though, we're going to have to see what the Biden administration puts in its place. There have been talk about a new asylum system. I think we don't know enough details to know whether that's going to be something we would approve of, but we'll have to wait and see. But right now, I think overall, they really deserve a lot of credit for getting rid of so many of the egregious Trump administration policies.
Well, thank you, Lee. Later on in the panel, some of the other panelists will be talking a little bit more about child separation and what they see through their eyes. And let's move on to Monica at this point. Monica, we want you to address the realities and maybe the misinformation on trafficking. I know you have a wide range of knowledge on immigration, but you've spoken on trafficking. I believe you gave your TED talk on trafficking. And why don't you tell us, we've been hearing a lot about trafficking, and can you describe what is it and who are the victims of trafficking?
Thank you so much, Richard, for having me, for the question. Thank you to the panelists. I just want to say, Lee, thank you for everything that you've said. I think you brought up a lot of trauma that we were all feeling during the last 4 years while everything was coming thrown at us. And so thank you for all the work that you've done and all the nonprofits on the ground, because you can really see the nonprofits and their reach rising and having to step in when others couldn't. And so my big gratitude and, all my admiration goes to all the nonprofits and volunteers on the ground, because we couldn't have gotten through the last 4 years unless we had that. And we're still, as Lee mentioned, unpacking and really trying to figure out where we go next. And so with human trafficking, with the highlight most recently, I've been seeing some of the, newspapers in Texas, talking about an increase in human trafficking. And my response to that is human trafficking has been happening. Unfortunately, it's been happening over the last, for years, and a lot of attention was given to it in the last 20 years when the TVPA, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, was passed in 2000, and that's when we actually could define it, we could name it, and we had federal laws to help, to assist any trafficking victims. And so since 2000, I began doing this work in 1998, and in 2000, when the TVPA was passed, there was, like I mentioned, a lot lot more attention given to human trafficking. It started off with let's talk about sex trafficking, but not really incorporating labor trafficking that has also been happening. And I know that the ABA has really been pushing. So my gratitude also goes to the ABA to also incorporate labor trafficking into the conversation. And I would say in the last 8 years, I've seen more of that talked about. My perspective is from Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia. That's where I'm based. And I have seen it happen, more and more. So the reason why human trafficking, I think, is in the news right now is because it's these buzzwords, the human trafficking buzzwords, the sex trafficking buzzwords that a lot of folks are really latching onto and want to say that some of Biden's policy is not helping. It's going to make it even more rampant. And I've, seen some news articles on that, some media, articles on that as well. But I want to remind everyone that it has been happening. And unfortunately, whenever there's vulnerability exposed, human trafficking has happened, will happen. Over the last 20 years, many drug traffickers have gone from just drug trafficking to maybe both or human trafficking. The one data point that leads to more human trafficking is, humans are reusable, right? You use a drug, it's gone, you can't traffic it anymore, but humans are reusable. And so when you see children, at the border, and I'd love, for the panelists to also talk about this too, there is more of an opportunity there if there's, folks waiting in Mexico for their asylum case to be heard or not being allowed into the US. There is more of an opportunity for traffickers to take advantage of that situation, but it has been happening and, it's been part of our system for a very long time.
Hey, Monica, can you tell us who gets trafficked and how do they traffic people and who does the trafficking? Is there smugglers?
It's yes. So there's, a variety of folks who are doing the trafficking. Some of them are smugglers, but smuggling and human trafficking is very different. Smugglers are, paid to bring, folks to the border, over the border, and then they're released. So that is not human trafficking. When immigrants are released, that is called smuggling. And I just want to really clarify that because I think I've seen over the years, everyone confuse the term of smuggling and human trafficking together. Trafficking, the definition of trafficking, which you had asked before, is fraud or coercion. There has to be an element of that so that, when you're being brought over the border, you're held, you're not released, and then you're forced into a situation that you did not agree to. And that is called human trafficking. That's the most basic way to say it. And the definition is in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is federal law, which is how we are able to file the T visa, which is the trafficking visa, but it's also pretty defined. And so I really wanted to clarify smuggling versus trafficking.
Can you give us an example of somebody that, I think you mentioned sex and labor trafficking. Can you give us an example of either one or both of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I was previously at the Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network, which was, a nonprofit that provided free legal services to immigrant victims of crime and persecution, we had a few cases, that came from Mexico where, and some of these cases you can read in the media, it was litigated by the U.S. Attorney's Office. So the traffickers later were able to spend up to more than 40 years in jail for committing this crime. But one, way that girls, 14, 15, 16-year-old girls were brought to the U.S. was called romancing, where there would be traffickers in their, town romancing these girls. They would find them, maybe work working at a taco stand, or maybe, a friend of a friend, and the traffickers would promise these girls better lives and said, if you were to come with me to the United States, then we can go ahead and start a new life. I'll get you a job in the restaurant industry, cleaning, you can take care of kids. Please come with me to the United States. And so the 15-year-old girl, the child would agree, the teenage girl would agree, and then the trafficker would bring her over. But the moment he brought her over, things would change. And that was a different, situation for her then. And it became very, very rough. And so there was, she wasn't allowed to leave. She was forced into sex prostitution. And we've seen some cases like that, but I don't want to paint the situation with a broad stroke and say every situation is like that. It really is different. And that's why combating human trafficking is so hard, because it is deep rooted. If, it takes a while for the survivor to even realize that they've been trafficked, because in the situation I just described, she was romanced and thought that her trafficker loved her. And maybe there were circumstances that he forced her into this situation, but she had to do it. And so it's very complicated. And I just want to make sure I highlight that too, because I think one issue I've seen is folks really want to take care of human trafficking as if it's an easy, crime to take care of. And it's really not. It's deep-seated and rooted with some of the manipulation and mind games that the trafficker plays.
So what do you think some of the steps are that would help combat it?
I think we have to, be honest about what we're, hearing. And the administration before, the Trump administration, their policies, as Lee mentioned, has put us in a very dire situation, and we're recovering from that. And so that's why it's taking longer for some of the new Biden policies to take effect. There's going to be a bottleneck. There's going to be time before, families are completely reunited. We really, it didn't take very long for us and just a few people in the administration to really push these laws, through during these last 4 years. And it's going to take longer to uncover for it. So I really want to ask people to really just take their time, and if you think it's human trafficking, to really let the experts look into it. I think that human trafficking is such a buzzword right now that everyone is on a kind of they're very motivated to want to address it. And I really feel like the experts who understand the nuances and some of the challenges are the ones that need to get involved, just like it's going to take some time to come out of the last administration and the immigration policies that we were all left with after 4 years.
We have a question from the audience. Melissa wants to know, how is someone able to make it known that they are a victim of human trafficking?
It's hard. I've represented many victims of human trafficking, and it's rare for one to raise their hand and say, please find me, please see me, I'm a victim of human trafficking. People, victims who are trafficked don't even identify, don't even realize that they may be. And so I think it's really important to educate and have those safety nets of where victims, if they're even allowed to leave their premises, can go. It's important to let, faith-based, churches, social service organizations, shelters, anywhere that, and any place that can find a victim of those frontline places that can find a victim of human trafficking. It's really important to educate and really talk about what human trafficking is. And I think when you're by the border, especially in Texas, smuggling and human trafficking can get very confused. So having conversations about that. In my experience, it's very rare for someone to self-identify themselves as a victim of human trafficking. So it takes extra questions from law enforcement, from service providers, from lawyers to really figure it out and read between the lines.
We need to wrap it up on your portion, but a couple of questions. What countries do most of the human trafficking, the victims come from? And what should the audience do if they suspect that somebody is being trafficked?
So, from the Mexican border, you would think that it would only be Central American countries like El Salvador, Guatemala. That is true. However, we also have seen, human trafficking victims come through the border from, countries that are not adjacent to Central America, like India or Africa, the continent of Africa. And so I want to make sure that people know that it's not just what you would think. Close is not necessarily the only way to identify somebody who's a victim of human trafficking. And what can someone do? There's a great hotline, Polarized Project. They have the national hotline for when you do feel like you're encountering someone who may be a victim of human trafficking. And my also recommendation is wherever you are to look and see what are those immigrant serving organizations around you that you can talk to and talk this through and speak with someone who's an expert. And I know, law enforcement right now, we always used to recommend, still do, to call law enforcement. However, I say that in that, I always say law enforcement is someone you can call, but you may have to explain deeper with what you see going on.
Well, thank you for that presentation and eye-opening facts that you've given us. I'm going to move on to Priscilla, who is the supervising attorney at ProBar. You've heard ProBar mentioned several times. It's the ABA project down on the border. And she is going to talk to us about asylum, and she does a lot of work with the children. So Priscilla, can you just briefly say what ProBar is? And I know you're on the ground, so what's happening on the Texas border regarding immigration and asylum?
Oh, not much, not much. No, every day is a new adventure. So ProBar is a project of the American Bar Association. And what we do effectively is exactly in our title, we represent asylum seekers who are coming through the RGV. Our sector, which roughly will correspond between a little outside of McAllen down all the way to Brownsville. You can expand those areas though, is one of the most, if not the most trafficked or populated areas or popular places for people to cross. And it's a historical fact. When I was a senior in college, I was getting ready to come down to teach in Brownsville, Texas. And my roommate's mother had come from Nicaragua carrying my roommate and several of her siblings with her as they crossed the river. And she goes, "Oh, I know Brownsville." And I was like, "I'm sorry, what? You live in Miami? What were you doing in Texas?" And she's like, "Oh, everyone knows that's where you cross." This is a historical pattern that has been going on for well over 30 years now. And that was part of the funding and foundational reasons that ProBar was created, where and when it was founded. So this organization, what we do is incredible. My 2 years that I have been here, we try to provide every single possible assistance that we can to asylum seekers and their families. Due to current conditions, of course, we focus a lot on the children. But, I can tell a story of just this past week. We had a youth who we are representing, and her mother was pulled over on the side of the road. Her mother has been in the United States for 6 years, and she was expelled under Title 42. So suddenly we have a child who we are representing who's been reunified, whose own mother is suddenly put into a program that was never meant to work with folks who are in the interior of the United States, much less folks who've been here for 6 years and have children who were born in the United States as well. And she has been returned. Thanks to a team effort from across all of ProBar organizations, we were not only prepared to help this young woman figure out what to do if her mother could not come back, but we were also able to reach out to two folks on the other side of the border who are helping the United States government find additional exceptions to the T-42 program. And as of yesterday, the mother was back in the United States with parole. And that's a quick summary of what we do. Whole family, whole services. But of course, direct representation is our goal. So if you come down to see us, what would you do? Right now, I'm not sure with COVID, but once we are all back to quote unquote, whatever normal is, you will be helping us represent. And that means interviewing predominantly the adults. It's a little bit more difficult to get permission to interview children because of course they are children, so there's more protections, but you'll be interviewing, preparing for CFI, and hopefully representation. That's always our goal. Looking for those who have a passion and who are not afraid, frankly, of anything, much less an immigration judge or a system that may seem impossible to overcome. Don't be afraid, we'll show you how. So we represent folks, and on our good days, we win. On our bad days, we witness everything that Lee mentioned. We witness everything that Monica mentioned. And at times, all we can do is simply bear witness. And so I think probably the role that I have had, that I most cherish in my past 2 years, has been someone who has borne witness to, I don't even know if the word atrocity covers some of the things that we've seen here. So on our good days, we win and we represent and we get people back in, and on our bad days, we bear witness so that one day when there is a reckoning, there will be people who are ready to tell you exactly what happened. So that's ProBar in a nutshell. Asylum on the border right now is very, very difficult to say the least. The Title 42 program remains in place. And effectively what that means is that only unaccompanied children are being allowed into the United States to even present a claim. This oftentimes presents a conundrum for us because many, not all, but many of the children do have families waiting in Mexico. So a child will come into the United States because it is the safest option. If you have not seen the pictures of the migrant camp that has now formed in Reynosa, please look at them. If you don't know where Reynosa is, please feel free to look at the camp in Matamoros. It is no place for a child. It is no place for anyone. They literally are people sleeping on streets of some of the most dangerous cities in Mexico, cities that we as US citizens are not advised to even enter. And we are expecting families to simply let their children stay. So families, many make the best choice that they can in the circumstances in which they are presented. And their children do come into the United States. But that presents a problem for us because children are children and they do not always know the full details or the reasons that their families chose to escape. I will say that I have yet to hear a child describe a life or circumstances that I do not feel merit hearing in a court. These aren't frivolous. People aren't coming for fun. This is life or death. But oftentimes the children don't have the full ability to explain to us what happened and why. Of course, many children are coming on their own. They tend to be older. And the vast majority do have family in the United States. But again, their claims are also not frivolous. Almost to a single one, I fully and truly believe that if they are sent back, they will be harmed. Of that, there's almost no doubt. And that's kind of a quick summary of what's happening here on the border, and I'm happy to take additional questions.
And we've heard stories of the migrants that come from Central America and other places. And I know that there's no general story. Every story is different. But is there one that stands out in your mind of somebody making a long trip? And what happens to them once they get to the border and are seeking asylum?
Yeah, I can think of, I'll tell one from the adult side, which is where I had most of my experience. If you are at all familiar with Nicaragua, and even if you're not, you're about to get a crash course. They have been effectively under a dictatorship for many years, but the dictatorship stepped up its game in 2018. There is no escaping the government of Nicaragua within its borders. There is no escaping the police. There is no escaping Ortega. Those who have alternate views of how society should run are systematically persecuted. They are absolutely put into jail. They're absolutely tortured. And so I represented a man who came because he actually helped count the votes. He was a police officer who helped count the votes. And he saw irregularities. And he had the audacity to say something. And thus began a 2-year saga in which other officers chased him throughout Central America. He finally realized he had to come to the United States. Upon entering the United States, he finally felt he was safe. Unfortunately, he was detained, and he was extremely confused, having been someone who had always worked on the side of the law his whole life. He was my first case that I did remotely. We ended up having to represent him through the telephone. There was no camera. I was never able to see his face. He was never able to see the judge's face. We did the entire thing through the phones. And ultimately, he lost his case. And at the end of the day, it wasn't even about evidence. We knew he was a police officer. We knew what he had done. But at the end of the day, the judge simply said, they probably won't hurt you if you go back. And that is, at the end of the day, that's just simply not what we stand for as a country. And that was case after case after case. People coming because they said something, they stood up for democracy, and yet they're still pushed back. And in fact, there's a very famous case of a group of Nicaraguan educated youth who came towards the end of the Trump administration. And when they were forced to return, we T-42'd them. We didn't even allow them to show the documents that proved who they were. They were in our State Department reports listed as people who were fighting against the regime. And we still deported them without so much as giving them an interview. They were mocked, and to this day, they are being targeted, and some have died. And those are the cases that we are seeing. For children, it is a very mixed bag. And in large part, it's a lot harder to say because, again, the information gap. But one example is as simple as young children coming and explaining that, well, they're indigenous, you see. There is nothing left for them. The rains took everything. The weather patterns have changed. There's no more food. And they are literally starving. Literal starvation in places where there is plenty of food. In nations that have fertile soils, there's literal starvation due to a long-term policy of the state to ensure that those who are of indigenous background do not have access to any resources, quite literally including food and water. And these are the stories that we hear every single day. But of course, it's hard to generalize, but that's kind of a preview of what I see down here.
Susan is asking if there are any plans to address the issue by the current administration. And we know the vice president went down to Central America. Do you have any hopes for the outcome of that?
I do. I think Lee put it really well. This is a very different administration. Let us not mince words here. I mean, the things are much better. I can sleep much better at night. But we are still negotiating as to how and what the new system will look like. There have been some movement. This has been in the news. You can Google, but we're calling it the consortium. There's a group of NGOs on the Mexican side, not US side, that is working with the United States government to help people enter the US and plead asylum in spite of Title 42. And it is working. People are getting in. It's a slow process, a kind of painstaking process, but it is working. And every day there are staff attorneys at ProBar that are on, working with White House calls and debriefings and attempting to bring the concerns of the border from the folks on the ground to the White House. So I am hopeful, but if you happen to know a timeline, Richard, I'd love to hear it. I think we all would. The faster, the better.
What about Susan also is asking about resources to Mexico, and basically, can you comment on the flow of asylum seekers? Is it more now? Is it increasing, decreasing, and and the backlog of the courts?
Okay, so I can start with backlog of the courts. Backlog of the courts is horrifying, over 1 million cases. No idea how that's going to be handled when the courts start running again here on July 6th, the non-detained courts, of course. I don't have an answer for that. That I can say, though, is probably going to be addressed because it's something that we have a lot of control over. And the new Attorney General is going to have almost full say as to how that's handled. So I feel pretty confident that will be taken care of. As to the Mexican side of the issue, it is really hard for us to say if things have increased or even decreased. Why? Title 42 takes away a lot of our usual ways of gathering data. I'll give an example. You will see statistics that say 300,000 apprehensions at the border. But remember, under Title 42, the same people keep crossing. They keep attempting to enter the United States. So we have no clear idea of what's really happening on the ground, in part because of the Title 42 policy. It is taking away our usual forms of growth. But I can say this much. If it were higher, I wouldn't be shocked. Why? We are just coming out of COVID. The pandemic has devastated Latin America, in addition to which they had multiple environmental events that are changing the world as we understand it, and are taking away the last bit of whatever people have left, the last reasons to stay. In addition to which, the governments, particularly of Central America, have taken advantage of the situation, and they are increasingly more dictatorships. I mean, if you can look at the country of El Salvador, you're actually seeing a president say, no, I don't like the Supreme Court, I'm going to get rid of them. No, I don't like these people, I'm going to do this. And that is happening as well in Nicaragua. Honduras is a very delicate situation with the president who may or may not have questionable ties to narco trafficking. And so you have a situation in which instability already existed. You added COVID, and now you add environmental factors. And of course, people know that their lives are in danger. They make rational decisions. And so we don't know how many people there are at the border, but I can tell you there are thousands waiting. And they all are seeking something very simple: protections that we have promised in the decades since World War II, and that we are no longer adhering to.
There are a couple of questions left that are kind of fast. One, run out of time, is what can, Renee's asking what people that don't live near the southern border can do to help.
Call your congressman. I don't care if it's a blue state. I don't care if it's a blue congressman. I don't care if it's a red state. I don't care if it's a red congressman. They're listening. They're counting the phone calls. If you can't get through the line, mail them. If you can't get through the emails, 50-50. If you really want to bother them, I guess you can fax. I don't know if that still exists, but in my days as a Capitol Hill intern, it did make a difference. And the other thing you can do is educate your communities. The way that this stops is by changing who we vote for and how we vote, and what we consider important issues and what we consider doable. And that all starts because people who are empathetic and people who are willing to listen, talk to their friends. That's how we are able to organize as a community and actually create lasting change, because keep fighting through the courts is a very narrow path. So that's what I tell people. Also donate money to all of our organizations every day. And also, of course, seek volunteer opportunities when and if you can. It's a little tricky in COVID-19, but especially as things hopefully open back up, those are my recommendations.
Okay, say somebody has a little bit of time to give. They don't live close to the border. Can they volunteer for Pro Bar?
They can, depending upon their skills or language abilities, their time. And I'll go ahead and drop, there's an email that you can go ahead and contact, and I'll go ahead and grab that right now and pass that on.
Okay, and one final question before we go on to Daniela. Your grandparents were migrant workers. And so you've been around that. How do you feel personally now that you get the opportunity to represent these people?
I never was supposed to be an immigration lawyer, because where I grew up, nobody was an immigrant. My family are multi-generation Mexican Americans. And so when I got into immigration work, I think the thing that struck me most is that everyone looked like my grandparents. Everyone looked like my cousins. Everyone looked like my family. And it brought home to me that this is not an issue about whether somebody has a document saying that they were born in the United States, but rather this is about who counts as an American, who counts to have as a human, who counts as someone who will change our country for the better. And I am very proud that I stand up for those who look like me, who might be related to, quite frankly, I might be related to some people. And I'm proud of that. And I want them here, and I want to stand up for them, and I won't ever stop.
Well, we have a question from Judy. Says, if you had to prioritize, should lawyers volunteer or donate or demand legislative changes? My guess is all of the above, but do you have anything else to add?
All right, so I have to say donation, because hey, we're nonprofits. I can't say no, but if you can get a hold of a congressman who might be wavering in their support of immigration reform, or who might think that it's easier to punt the issue, for me, at least, at the end of the day, that's what's going to make my life and the lives of these folks much, much better. But also donate.
Thank you. Thank you. Daniela, let's go on to you. You're on the ground. And as I introduced you and we talked about, you said, think about the type of work I do. Think about what Cesar Chavez was doing. Can you talk to us a little bit about the migrants, the guest workers? Kind of what do you do?
Well, thanks, Richard. And thank you very much to the ABA for the invite to speak on the panel. And it's been both very inspiring and also motivating to hear the other panelists. So I appreciate being included. It's interesting to me, I think, to hear the other panelists' perspective, which I wholly believe, about how difficult it is for many people to come to the country, because the flip side of the coin is the work that I do, where I represent people who are immigrants, documented or otherwise, or people who participate in our guest worker programs, who are really funneled into and encouraged by employers in the agricultural industry to come to feed our country, and who are the backbone of an industry that generates trillions of dollars of revenues in this country, but who work under the worst wage and occupational conditions of anyone in our nation. So the kind of work that we do at Legal Aid is we're free civil legal services for people. And as a farm worker advocate, I'm one of many advocates, not a sufficient number, of course, but many advocates that represent migrant and seasonal farm workers in different states. So pretty much every state in the country has some funding from the Legal Services Corporation, which is the federal entity that funds legal aid programs, to represent specialized populations, and migrant and seasonal farm workers are one of those populations. And the reason in particular that we represent that group is because they're a highly vulnerable population, and the agricultural industry itself is based off the backbone of slavery. That was its origins, and has one of the highest levels of non-compliance or law breaking in the country. So what we do is we are literally in the field. We have paralegals and outreach workers, as well as legal staff such as myself, that will go and do information and community education trainings to migrant workers or to seasonal workers. The difference between the two being migrant workers will travel great distances, including across the country for work, whereas seasonal workers may have put down roots in a particular area, but work in agriculture. So for those that are familiar with the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, we have a lot of seasonal workers here in the citrus crop, some in detasseling of corn, a lot in melons right now. And then many of those workers from all across the Texas-Mexico border are people who migrate to complete other states and will do some of the same work in other places. So, I mean, just to focus on issues that have happened during the pandemic, because I think the pandemic has really exacerbated a lot of the deficiencies in the social safety net that we've had. There's been a lot of, well-deserved credit that's been given to people who are hospital workers, people who are nurses, or who are teachers, restaurant workers, and all of that's extremely valid. But farm workers, I feel like, are really under-celebrated in that respect. And they're workers who were deemed essential workers, much like workers in the meatpacking industry, but didn't really see any of the financial or social safety net benefits that others were able to obtain. So, for example, we do also represent other low-wage workers and meatpacking workers. And you all might have been aware that there were a lot of COVID exposures that happened in meatpacking plants across the country, including deaths. And our organization was involved in winning one of the first workers' compensation lawsuits on behalf of an exposed meatpacking worker against JBS in Cactus, Texas, which is in the panhandle of Texas. And our client was able to establish that he was infected with COVID when at the time there were more than 800 workers that were infected with COVID. And I think the comparison between the difficulties that meatpacking workers faced and the farm workers faced is that it was all extremely difficult. Many people that work in very high occupancy workplaces where line speed and processing and productivity requirements, which were just really inhumane before with respect to the impact that it has on people's ergonomics, were exacerbated by not permitting for social distancing at all, And then farm workers, of course, have to deal with very high occupancy housing also when they're migratory. And I think one of the big differences between things that farm workers were exposed to and other low-wage workers, including meatpacking workers, has to do with the lack of the ability federally for farm workers to be able to organize. There are a lot of historical exemptions or vestiges of historical racism which still exists today that exclude farm workers from legal protections. And one of them is that agricultural workers are exempt from the National Labor Relations Act. And so while meat packers, for example, were able to negotiate through unions like the CIW or the Commercial Food Workers Unions, temporary increases in their pay to continue working during the pandemic as essential workers and restaurant workers were too, where they could unionize. Farm workers were always essential workers, but were never given any kind of a wage increase. And unfortunately, in many states, a lot of farm workers still work at minimum wage. So in some of the southern states where we represent workers in Texas, Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Mississippi, plus any other state where people who reside in those states migrate to. So we do a lot of work in the Midwest. And in most of those states, the minimum wage is the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25 an hour. And unfortunately, a lot of our cases have to do with minimum wage underpayment, where people who get paid on a piece rate, so X amount per bucket of tomatoes or per bag of onions, still comes out less than $7.25 an hour. And so I think it's really important to support other industries in their campaigns, like the Fight for 15. But when we're talking about farm worker issues, we're talking about a minimum wage that's half of what people are trying to work up to. So some of the issues that we really focused on during the pandemic had to do with workplace safety. Unfortunately, as difficult as the US government was making it for people to enter through other programs, our organization and a lot of other farm worker rights organizations and some farm worker unions in states where unions are permitted, like in the Pacific Northwest, in Ohio and California, sent a letter to our then Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of Commerce, and Secretary of Agriculture, encouraging them for guest workers who are lawfully allowed to enter the US to work at particular farms, to be screened for COVID and to have quarantine housing available for workers so that they're not living in barracks housing with hundreds of other workers with their health status being unknown. And when in April and in May, the US government had shut down the processing of visas from virtually any country, the opposite was going on. And US consulates were told to expedite the processing of guest workers so that we could have farm workers. And while it's wonderful that we have a vaccine now, a lot of the efforts that we're working on right now are collaborating with other social service providers like the National Center for Farm Worker Health or migrant health clinics across the country or community health clinics that serve undocumented populations to try and get the vaccine out to people that live not just in rural areas where we know that there are real difficulties with access to the vaccine, but people who live on employer-provided property, who don't have their own transportation because they were bussed in, including from another country, by their employer, who have tremendous language barriers. About 77% of farm workers in the US speak only Spanish, and 75% of them are foreign born. So they may have lawful status, including many of our immigrant or our non-immigrant guest worker populations. Many of them have lawful status, but their status is tied to their employer. So we've been representing workers, unfortunately, who've fallen ill, who have workers' comp related claims and breach of contract related claims, also helping them deal with all of the consumer debt associated with their hospital bills, disability. And then we've been working to try and push the administration to develop more workplace safety requirements, not just in the meatpacking industry, which we're very hopeful for, but are frustrated with how long that's been taken, but also to develop better health and safety protections to address whatever the next pandemic it is, but also to make sure that there are enough resources and agencies like in OSHA or in the Department of Labor to actually go out and conduct necessary investigations and catch a lot of the legal violations that were going on before. I think, Priscilla's clients, Lee's clients, Monica's clients may at some point end up becoming my clients because they're very vulnerable people, and there isn't as much enforcement with respect to immigration in the agricultural industry because everyone knows, the dirty little secret of agriculture is that more than the majority of people are undocumented, and that makes them highly vulnerable. So it's on some days it's cool to say I work on Cesar Chavez issues. On other days it's quite frustrating because we shouldn't still be having the same conversation from 40, 50 years ago. But I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to you all about it. And with respect to people who just want to get involved, I second what Priscilla said about getting in touch with your legislators. Anytime that there are proposals up, I'd like to give a shout out to our colleagues at Farmworker Justice, which is a nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. that does a lot of lobbying work in conjunction with the farm worker unions in states that have unionizing protections like the United Farm Workers. And I think some of the major issues that they're going to be working on that are going to be a huge benefit have to do with dealing with a lot of those historical exclusions. Agricultural workers under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the federal minimum wage law, are entirely excluded from overtime protections. In some instances, they're also excluded from minimum wage protections. And again, in states that don't have those additional protections, which is quite a lot, especially in the South, that really creates a huge, not even going to call it a wealth gap. It keeps people in sub-poverty conditions. And there's a lot of progress that needs to be made on health and safety. We don't have a national heat stress standard. So as hot as people think it is here in July, it's a lot harder when you work outdoors, when you don't have your right being obeyed to adequate water in the fields, and when you don't have a right to AC and you live in a cinder block barrack. There are a lot of health and safety things that we'd like to see passed and historical exclusions lifted, including a lot of state exclusions from workers' compensation coverage. We'd like to think that at a minimum, people who are deemed essential workers, if they are injured, have sick leave or sick pay or a workers' compensation policy to cover them. And in many states, including in Texas, that's optional and not provided for farm workers. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this and to be able to put this in context with everything else that's going on with immigrants.
Danielle, thank you very much for the presentation. And Priscilla, Monica, Lee, thank you guys for participating. But we still have a little bit of time left. So, and we've been getting a number of questions, and to the audience, sorry we haven't gotten to them all. As I said earlier, we'll try to answer them after the panel if we can. But I'd like to throw it open on a round table for the four of you. Can you guys unmute yourselves? Daniela, there you go. So we have a few minutes. Does anybody want to ask one of the other panelists a question or comment? Well, in that case, I'm going to read a couple of the questions.
Richard, I'm happy to jump in. I think we've all heard, how exhausting it's been over the last 4 years, and I'd love to just throw it out there, because we're amongst friends. What keeps you going? I'd love to know, because I think I love hearing what keeps other advocates going, because I try to take a little light from there.
Lee?
Oh, I was going to let Danielle and Priscilla start, but I guess I can start. I think for me, I may be a little older than some of the other panelists. And so I've actually been at the ACLU 30 years, basically my whole career. And there's been a lot of ups and downs. I think one of the things I've learned is probably not to get too high with victories and get too depressed with losses, because there's always going to be so many losses. But ultimately, I would say that the only thing that really keeps me going is the clients. I think as tired as I'm getting, and as emotionally drained, and it could be 4 a.m. and you're working on a brief quarter, then when you go and meet with the clients and you see their courage and their resiliency and their perseverance and how much their lives are at stake, I think ultimately that's what keeps you going, for at least for me. I think without that, it'd be very hard just as an abstract to work as hard as we all work.
The other day, somebody asked me a similar question, and my response is, well, there's right and there's wrong. And you just do what's right.
Yeah.
Priscilla, you want to jump in next?
Yeah, mine is a little more personal. I mean, a lot of people sacrificed a lot so that I could be where I am today. And my grandparents who raised me very much made sure that I understood that this isn't just about me. This isn't about me at all. This is about an entire community of people, of vulnerable people who deserve assistance. And yes, it sounds kind of mature for a 5-year-old, but ever since I was 5 years old, I knew I was going to be a lawyer. I knew I was going to stand up for people, and I will not ever back down from that. And upon learning and becoming immersed in the world of immigration, I fight because I truly believe that this determines what kind of nation we really are. And I was born in Camp Lejeune. I'm the daughter of 2 Marines. My uncle was a Marine, my other uncle in the military, my cousin's a Green Beret. And I will be danged if this nation does things that is not in my name that I would not agree with, in my name that does not uphold our values. And this is the ultimate test of our values. How we treat strangers is how we determine and how we will be judged as a society. And I will bear witness and fight for that until my dying breath. And that is really what has kept me going. Particularly the previous 2 years, they were a little rough.
Danielle, I'm going to jump to you next. What keeps you going?
I agree with what Lee said. It's the clients. I mean, no matter how difficult the circumstances are, our clients have such resiliency and also such continued faith in what our country should be able to provide as far as belief in the ideals that we espouse, and that they have a very realistic sense of what one can or can't accomplish. Every time I have bad news to deliver to clients, it's never something that you want to do, but I'm just really surprised by how well they take it and how their response is like, okay, so then what do we try next? Or for the betterment of the community, what might we be able to try? And so their creativity and their resilience, I think, is what keeps me going. That and the support of other people in the community who, even if they're not involved in the day-to-day work, express that support, including like what Priscilla said, by contacting their legislators is really helpful. We're often advocates who are painted as the zealots, or there are those do-gooders, tree huggers, people who are Pollyannish. But I think to the extent that there's more of a groundswell amongst the community that really does define what we think is acceptable or not acceptable and makes those issues a lot more mainstream, it's really very, very helpful.
Before I jump to Monica, you guys have been talking a lot about contacting your legislators. One of the questions from one of the attendees says, well, what do we tell the legislature? So what do we need to do, and what do we tell them when you contact them? What do you say?
If I could answer that, to start off, tell them you care. I think, legislators don't realize how many people on the ground care. They're used to hearing from me. They're used to hearing from Priscilla. They probably don't want to hear from us, although, we have, gotten, far by talking with them. However, tell them you care and tell them that this is wrong, what you're seeing, hearing, and that there is, a group out there of those who want to see something different. And I think if you keep it to that basic level, and then of course, tie in everything that you're seeing, that's the way to get through. I think what I've heard from legislators are, I didn't know anyone cared. I didn't get a call. No one raised any issues. So I went with what I thought I knew. Let them know that there's a different way.
And when you say, tell them you care, okay, what action item do you want them to do?
I think, of course, it's always important to be in sync with what's happening in your state. I come from Georgia, so being in sync with what happened in our state really, really helped us. But I, want to say, keep your eyes open, talk to immigrant rights groups. They need the support there so you could hear what actually is on the ground, because in every state it's going to be different. And so if you keep your ear to the ground of what potential policies or laws could be passed, like English only, for example, tried to be passed many times here in Georgia. Those are the things that you can stop and have an opinion on and call your legislator on.
Yeah, I would say like groups such as the ACLU, but also more groups like United We Dream, or within each state, you're going to have different groups. Like in Kansas, where I used to work, big shout, Sunflower Community Action. You will be able to find the specific bill. At this moment in time, I am not sure that the Senate is considering anything for immigration. I think the House maybe has, but our real battle is in the Senate. If you're looking federally, at least my analysis, please correct me. I don't mind being corrected. But so when that legislation comes up, of course, call. And if you're on, I use United We Dream because they really text me constantly, and that's the reason they're at the forefront of my mind. So get with those groups. You can really just Google, Texas immigrant rights organizations. You're going to find a ton. So ProBar is part of the ABA. I can't go and say, oh yes, support this bill. But what I can say is support. You can ask them to support immigration reform. And you can say, be humane. You can say, let them in. You can say, stop Title 42. You can say, if you're in Texas, our governor has been on a little bit of a rampage. So literally just be like, everything Abbott says, no. What is going on? Protect the children. It can be that simple. They listen to us and sometimes, and when they do, it's exactly that. You guys, you're too in it. You're just a do-gooder, and I am kind of, but really people do care. So it can be super simple, and get with local organizations. They'll tell you the exact bill numbers that they are supporting or opposing.
So I have a question I want to throw to the panel. We have a few more minutes. The Trump administration was big on building the border wall. And now, as Priscilla was saying, the Texas governor is going to take up that wall and wants to build the wall. Have you seen any change, or is it effective in whatever they're trying to do?
I don't think a wall stops anyone from fleeing for their lives, and it never will.
Monica, I want to circle back to you. And what keeps you going?
Oh, thank you for asking. I think, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer at the age of 11 because my parents were immigrants. They came when they were 18 years old. And I saw how immigrants were treated differently. My aunt was a victim of domestic violence. To me, seeing that and knowing there were options for her, but her not being able to connect with those options because of language access, because of not understanding the system, because of not knowing, what would happen, not having a lawyer, if she were to report what were happening, was really a tragedy in my mind. And I wanted to be part of, a group that could help and help those who wouldn't be able to access legal services themselves. And so for me, using my legal education, one that we paid a lot for, one that we spent a lot of time, getting, is a privilege and an honor to do it for those who need us the most. My plug to you all, I've seen a lot of chat messages on volunteering, wherever you are, no matter what you do, private sector, wherever you're at, there are always opportunities to volunteer and make a difference. I know you're all making a difference nonetheless, but if you do want to volunteer, please, go to your firm, to their pro bono department. We need you. And I feel like we have a talent that can assist those in all aspects, in all social justice movements, not just immigration. Pick one that you're passionate about, and volunteer your time, your efforts, because you'll see that case not only will impact the person that you're helping, but it stays with you forever.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but I would like to underscore the obvious. The elephant in the room is that our country needs you. They need everybody right now. Our country is in very, very, very perilous times, and it's all hands on deck. As I was telling others, this is a participant sport. You can't sit on the sidelines today, but I'm going to give the panel about 30, 40 seconds to just tell us closing thoughts. What closing thoughts would you have for the audience and for America? Lee?
Well, I think I would echo what the other panelists have said and what you just said, Richard, is just to get involved. One of the things I sort of hear from people is, well, the problems are too big. We can't really make a dent in them, or I'm not sure what, just do any little thing. It's helpful. Just, help one person in any way you can, or volunteer for one day. I think that's the key, because this is, there's no sort of silver bullet to solving it all. It really is just hard work and a grind, and you all can get involved. You don't need to have immigration background experience. People can train you. Just do any little thing you can, I think, is helpful. I really think that people get deterred from thinking they need to do some huge thing in order to make an impact. And I just feel like just do anything, one little thing, 3 hours here, 3 hours there. And you all have said that very powerfully, and I think that's absolutely right.
Priscilla?
Having lived in a lot of red states for most of my life, I can say that one thing I think, and I wish more people had done, is make a welcoming environment. And sort of picking up on what Lee said, it can be as simple as, with you, people are safe, and you make it clear that you are willing to stretch yourself a little bit to maybe get an interpreter, work with someone who's speaking more slowly. And I mean, that can even take place in church. There are entire churches here in the Rio Grande Valley that are completely segregated just based on language issues. Be the person who goes to the other one. Be the person who shows up, and at least those in the community can know that you're a friend. If nothing else, especially those of you who are sitting there in red states saying, I'm not so sure that this is, what I can do. Be the kind person in the community. Be that person.
Monica, you got about 30 seconds to give your final thoughts.
Absolutely. The one thing I've noticed over the last 4 years is that the organization's community, people who care, are now louder and prouder about showing their support for immigrants. I've been doing immigration law for 23 years. The last 4 years, although it was terrible, the only shining light was that people came out of the woodworks to really stand by us and show that they cared. Continue to do that. While we have a different administration, the needs are still there. You can do a class action case. I'm sure Lee would love that. Also, do the little things, because that is super important as well. Volunteer at a refugee girls' school. Do something that sits with you, because that will make a difference.
And Daniela, 30 seconds. What's your closing thoughts?
I agree. I think one volunteer opportunity leads to another, and people have all kinds of talents. We had a client in the fall who came from Mexico and got sick with COVID, and didn't know where he was because he was living in a camp, even though it was in the middle of town. He didn't know how to read street signs and things, and was left sick alone when the rest of the crew went to work, and ended up stumbling outside, just looking for food or help because he couldn't breathe. And there was a neighbor, a good Samaritan, who called 911 for him. He didn't know that 911 existed because he came from Mexico. And that Good Samaritan, helped save a life because EMS then came. And then when that client was getting ready to get discharged from the hospital, because they couldn't keep patients for very long, we another them with us, and we were able to help him get a ride from the hospital that he was discharged from to a state facility where he could quarantine for several weeks, when many agencies, were shut down. And this was just someone in the community who didn't speak Spanish, but who knew that this was a person that was stranded and would otherwise go back to a camp with hundreds of people, and who decided that, they would be willing to take that risk and, take $40 out of their own pocket for that gas money. And there were other people that then brought that person food, who got him well enough. We've had other people who contributed to funeral expenses, and none of those require legal talents. So certainly folks that have legal talents in addition to just, a compassionate heart, I think should just get started someplace and then see where you can find your niche. And everybody had something to contribute.
And, something I found is that acts of kindness and caring are contagious. So, don't think that you're alone in the struggle. We're out of time. I would like to thank the speakers. You all have been tremendous in my book, and not only for being on the panel, but I want to thank you for everything you do and the day in, day out struggles that you find, and for your commitment. And to the audience, I would like to thank you for participating. It's obvious that you care. And we wish you well, and we wish everybody well. Thank you very much to the speakers and the audience.